Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week, we're going to hear two specials in two separate episodes, basically exploding the radio edition into its components. In this edition that you've clicked on, you'll hear Elle, who works with the Richmond Community Bail Fund, and Buzz talk about their experiences in the streets and doing anti-repression work in Richmond, Virginia, throughout the uprising against police killings sparked by the murder of George Floyd in so-called Minneapolis. Check the show notes for links to the amazing projects that they reference. If you want to hear the other half of this disjointed pair, you can look for the episode called Omaha in the Uprising with Mel B, where anarchist journalist Mel B talks about the city, the marches, the killing of James Scurlock on May 30th, and the arrests of 120 people on July 25th. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Anarchism, a social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race.
Anarchism is not bombs, disorder, or chaos. It is not robbery or murder. It is not a war of each against all.
Anarchism is the very opposite of all that. Find out for yourself. Tune into Subversion 1312.
Live, Tuesdays 9 to 10 p.m.
on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM or streaming 4ZZZ.org.au.
Podcasts and related content available at subversion1312.org and
channelzeronetwork.com.
Conclusion?
We stand for anarchy, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-authoritarianism, internationalism,
autonomy, direct democracy, ecology, self-organization, solidarity, anti-fascism, anti-neoliberalism,
anti-nationalism, atheism, equality, and freedom.
But first, here are some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a
The Trump administration has been pushing for schools to mandatorily reopen in the fall. Like everything else this fascist weasel has advocated since the zombie apocalypse hit, his school reopening plans really have nothing to do with benefiting the students, but serves instead the larger economic order and his own political aspirations. Kids returning to school frees up their parents to return to work. Never mind that schools will be a veritable petri dish, spreading COVID-19 among students and teachers, and then to their families. In this context, the reopening of schools and the mandate for students to attend are clear and present dangers to the lives and well-being of all of us. I would suggest that this policy can't be carried out if the schools aren't there. If the schools happen to burn to the ground before the school year begins, there is no reopening. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying you should go out while everyone is wearing masks and go burn all the schools down. Well, wait. Yeah, I am. I'm saying we should all go out and burn the schools down. So look, before that idiot at the FCC calls the radio station again, let me make my case for burning down the schools as a public service. First, beyond the health risks, schools suck. We do the majority of our learning from birth to 5 years old. We're learning machines. Then, at age 5, we get sent to knowledge prison, regimented in rows and columns like miniature Nazi troops, subjected to noise pollution by adults who blather shit at us they themselves find boring. It's a 13-year process preventing us from exploring our world and learning important things about how the world really works. Instead, we get bombarded with useless information. It's so useless that we forget 90% of what we're taught. 90%. Shrinks have done numerous studies and found that we retain only 10% of what we're taught in school. That means we toss 90% of what we learn into the mental trash bin. We know we have no use for it, even when the teacher is teaching it to us. And you know the kicker? The teacher knows it's useless too. The teacher learned that garbage in school and summarily forgot it, which is why teachers all require teacher's guides. teacher's guides are necessary because the teachers themselves, long ago, tossed all that course information into their own mental trash bins. Given that we only retain 10% of what schools teach us, we could reduce the entire educational process from 13 years to just 2. Not only could we condense the educational process to just 2 years, but the people who run the schools have known this for decades. So, when you went to school, whenever that was, the folks in charge knew they were wasting 11 years of your life to teach you useless stuff they knew you weren't going to learn anyway. And yet, they paid the teachers and the principals, and they stuck you on a bus, and they crammed you into a classroom to suffer through it all the same. And you know why? Just to keep you busy until age 18 and keep you out of the job market. It's a process to keep you dependent and useless well into adulthood. And it works. Schools now are really completely useless. It used to be that schools at least taught you 10% that you retained. But now, you don't even need schools for that. Language, math, grammar programs online are just as effective as any public school. And so schools are obsolete. The real agenda that schools now serve is to selectively disable the poor and minorities through the inequitable distribution of educational resources. To affirm that Black Lives Matter, we need to scrap an educational framework that devalues Black lives. We're now in a situation where the schools do us no good, and in fact, might kill us. Back when I went to school, I felt like the English lit teachers babbling would kill me. Today, it really could. Really. So I'm suggesting a proactive approach, the abolition of schools, a future where young people take direct control of their own learning, a direct process not mediated by fascists who themselves cannot outsmart a virus. And you know what? If they didn't want schools burnt down, they wouldn't have made them out of such flammable materials. Just saying. Our survival requires us to expand our direct action approach. Burning cop cars and police stations was a good start. Tearing down statues of colonizers, racists, and slave owners was a fantastic continuation of that strategy. But there are a number of institutions that are part of this structural racism and oppression, including schools. They can topple just like statues. Gravity is very egalitarian. Gas is cheap, matches are free, and schools suck. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Also, if you want some free Sean Swain for President bumper stickers, send us a letter or email with your address and we'll send you some. So I'm joined by a couple of folks who are going to talk about the situation as it's grown and expanded in Richmond, Virginia. Would you all care to introduce yourselves with whatever names, affiliations, and pronouns that you'd like to share?
Sure. My name is Elle. I demand she, her, hers pronouns. I organize with the Richmond Community Bail Fund and some other anti-repression crews in Richmond doing community legal work.
My name is Buzz, he, him pronouns. I've been involved in a variety of rebellions and organizing over the past decade throughout Richmond and the region. And
Elle, would you mind saying a little bit about what the Richmond Bail Fund does and who participates in it? Like, is it a formal organization or an affiliation of people who are like just working to get folks out? Is it an ongoing thing or just like a protest-related bail fund?
Yeah, so RCBF has been around since the spring of 2017. Our primary focus, we serve folks who experience everyday criminalization in their lives. So we specifically have served folks that were not experiencing repression that is deemed quote unquote political. We have run jail support or a specific protest bail fund for other actions in Richmond. I would say specifically we've started doing that in the past couple years. But, the bail fund has been a revolving fund specifically for poor Black folks, BIPOC, in Richmond. With the uprising is when we started running 24/7 hotline and jail support in a new way that has now been, for over 60 days. And we do a lot of different work. We also support folks who are our friends that we post bail for who are then convicted. We support those folks while they're on the inside. That has really increased with COVID because folks are so isolated and visits are not allowed. So like a lot more time talking on the phone or putting money on people's commissary or trying to support folks as they need to get different supplies and et cetera into the jail, specifically to try and stay safe during COVID, the jail or the prison. We also, do transportation and reminders about court, help coordinate the pro bono attorneys for the protests. It has changed shape a lot, specifically during the uprising.
That's really awesome. That sounds like a really helpful range of work that y'all do. So possibly because of the scale and the range of the amount of just the cities across Turtle Island that have been engaged in, and around the world, but particularly around Turtle Island, engaged in protests against the killing of George Floyd and other folks, and against police violence in general, and against the heritage of white supremacy. There hasn't seemed to be a lot of national coverage of protests and resistance in Richmond. So I was hoping that y'all could share some of what you're aware of in this place. First, would someone care to give context for Richmond, its historic and contemporary significance to power, who lives there? Just sweeping generalizations.
Sure. I'll make an effort. So as many people know, so-called Richmond is situated on the fall line of what's now called the James River in colonized Powhatan territory in what's now the state of Virginia. Richmond came to prominence as a city in the post-colonial period and the foundations of the United States. And then during the period of the American Civil War, as many people know, it became situated as the capital of the Confederacy of the Southern states. And so Richmond is often seen as kind of the gateway to the South or a gateway to the North, depending on your position. And so it has a long history of very conservative yet bourgeois demographics. However, as in many cities in the United States, during the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of white flight and disinvestment in communities. And so we saw, a lot of physical devastation on the urban landscape. In the past decade or so, there's been a resurgence of urbanization. And so we've been seeing lots of white and upper and middle class folks storming back into the city for a variety of reasons. And so we've been seeing a lot of increased gentrification, especially in historically Black neighborhoods, which again is just a continuation of the dynamics that have been going on over the past century, really, since the 1930s, 1940s. But that being said, there's also been a long history of resistance in Richmond of various formations, including anarchists and communists, but as well as radical Black folks and Black organizations. We really want to lift up the Defenders for Freedom and Justice. They're a longtime organization that have been working to, one, both advocate for the removal of the Confederate monuments that until the beginning of July had lined Monument Avenue in Richmond, which were taken down, several by the people during the uprisings, and then the remainder were removed by the city due to quote unquote public safety issues. And so while I think many people have acknowledged that this iteration of the George Floyd rebellions is something kind of new and different, I would also want to remind everyone that it's just another iteration. This isn't something new, but resistance and rebellion has been ongoing And it just has these peaks and troughs of activity.
I think with the rapid gentrification that Buzz is mentioning, we have also seen shifts and changes in the expansion of criminalization in Richmond, specifically criminalization as it relates to the Black folks that live in the areas that are experiencing many waves of gentrification. It feels like we only serve like 6 facilities, the Richmond Bail Fund, in and around Richmond, but the amount of just like cash bail, for example, that we've seen kind of go through the roof, and just naming specifically, like with the expansion of that gentrification has also come the pretty rampant expansion of criminalization, both by building physical facilities, and also increasing things like pretrial, what that criminalization looks like.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing Buzz and Elle talk about the ongoing protests in Richmond, Virginia. And Richmond's also the capital of the state of Virginia, right? So that probably also increases or plays into the centralization of like capital and more money moving into the city.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's kind of interesting, one being the capital of the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, I should say, along with one of the largest public universities, Virginia Commonwealth University, is situated in the middle of the city. It actually has 2 campuses, a kind of arts and humanities campus, and then a medical campus closer to downtown. But what we have in the city of Richmond is multiple overlapping law enforcement jurisdictions. So there's the Richmond Police Department, which of course is citywide. There's the VCU Police Department, which has recently both expanded its jurisdiction and is also about to gain access to the Richmond Police software and database, so they can more easily track legal cases across these jurisdictions. And then we also have the Capitol Police, which govern the grounds of the state capitol, along with the property of the Lee Monument, which has been renamed the Marcus David Peters Circle in honor of Marcus David Peters, who was killed by police a couple years ago when he needed help, not death, during a mental health crisis. And then lastly, we also have the Virginia State Police, who have been the main arbiters of violence on demonstrators and protesters during this rebellion. So we kind of have all these overlaying factors on that police side.
You mentioned that Monument Ave has made some changes recently. I guess could one of you talk a little bit about, like, was Monument Ave a product of the late 1800s? Like, was it a product of the Confederate era, or the after Reconstruction, or the 1920s during the rise of the Second Klan? Because you see like the building of a lot of monuments to Confederate leadership or symbols around the country at different time periods.
Yeah, so the monuments along Monument Avenue were largely erected during late Reconstruction but really the turn of the century, so kind of the 1910s, 1920s. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is also headquartered in Richmond, they advocated and fundraised for many of those Confederate statues of various generals: Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, etc. And so they did this very intentionally to create this aura and the false narrative of a Southern pride sort of situation. And we know that the United Daughters of the Confederacy also influenced the way that textbooks have been written across the country, and literally whitewashing the history of the Civil War and kind of glossing over a lot of important history. So yeah, these monuments were erected largely around the beginning of the 20th century in a very discreet attempt to impose fear to the Black population and submission, as well as lifting up this narrative of the lost cause.
It's interesting because there's like a lot of statues and monuments that are coming down across Turtle Island, and a lot of folks will comment on like the ease or difficulty with which of how they feel different in Richmond to do that. And I think something interesting that I've learned since the uprising is that a lot of those monuments were built during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know, specifically, of course, to, like you're saying, Buzz, to inspire fear in Black folks, specifically, you know, folks who are engaging in civil rights work. And a lot of those monuments are made of cheaper materials, or are easier to bring down because they are more recent. While a lot of the monuments in Richmond, you know, that earlier timeline also means that they, are just made of different materials and are larger. And I think that has been an interesting difference that I'm seeing between Richmond and other places, is how much older and more like literally concrete some of those monuments are.
Like seeing video from Durham and Chapel Hill, for instance, of those monuments being toppled. Like, it was clear that when they fell, they just crumpled, like they were made out of crepe paper.
Right, exactly, or tin or copper, you know. And we have these enormous marble and stone monuments that some of them, you know, specifically the monument at Mark Xavier Peters Circle, you know, it would be unsafe in such a different way because of that.
Yeah, not to mention it's on like a 90-foot concrete pedestal.
Yeah, yeah.
So we'd have to get far away to take that down safely. Yeah, when some of the statues that were pulled down by the people, including the Columbus statue, Jefferson Davis, they were notably, like, they didn't crumble, which I thought was interesting, but were swiftly taken care of in other means regardless. Columbus ended up in a lake, and Jefferson jumped off his pedestal into the street on Monument Avenue.
Best thing he ever did.
Yeah. He's ran from Richmond again.
Do you know, with the monuments that have been withdrawn by the city or removed by the city, or state, like what's actually happening with those? I know there's been federal pressure to defend historical statues around the country, and I don't know if that happened later than when these were removed. But for instance, in North Carolina with Silent Sam in Chapel Hill, there was a big debate about building another structure for that statue to be in, or putting it into a museum, or just some sort of argument that this is a part of history and it must be held on to, or maybe a way to placate neo-Confederates who already were upset about the removal from public eye of these terrible statues.
Yeah, something that's really strange is that our Mayor Stoney, who is people often know his name because of the chant "Stoney's a crony," which I just love.
That's good.
Stoney, the mayor's office put up a fundraiser, like a GoFundMe style fundraiser, to remove monuments, to like do that safely and justly, which I think is laughable, largely because, like, of course they want to claim this and they want to profit off of it, but also there are so few left standing in Richmond, you know, because of the people. And, you know, many people have wondered if that money is actually for the removal of the monuments or for the storage and preservation of them, you know, because, as Buzz was saying, they don't crumple when they fall. Often they are detached from the pedestal, the literal pedestal that they are on, but the monument or the statue, the likeness itself is not damaged. And then, you know, tow trucks arrive and take those away. And there's been, you know, no transparency around where those are stored or what the plan for those is. The only like real legal or like court situation that we have seen around the monuments is a series of injunctions that have been filed in response to Governor Blackface Northam, who has said, I'm going to remove these monuments, or I'm going to remove the Lee Monument. It's got to go. And so first there was an initial injunction that was filed. That time passed. Some some folks in community occupied the office of the attorneys who filed for that injunction. So not the judge who approved it, but the attorneys who filed for it, which was a cool action that I haven't seen before. And there has now very recently been another injunction that a judge passed. So there's another, I believe, 90 days where the litigation of that, the removal of the Lee Monument at Marcus David Peters Circle, the opportunity for litigation extends even further about, if that monument will come down, at through the state's systems for doing so.
Yeah. And some additional context around the whole monument debate in Richmond. A couple of years ago, the Mayor Stoney DeCroney, he instituted, after long advocacy and pressure from the public, he instituted a commission to study the history and kind of different options for what are now removed monuments on Monument Avenue, but trying to answer that question: what should be done with these figures of the past? Whether to put them in a museum or create something new, or put them in some park, add context to the existing placements, what have you. And that was I think about a year or two process that was not very transparent in itself. But the result of that commission was basically, if I recall, the only thing that could really come to agreement on is that the Jefferson Davis statue should be removed because he's not even from Virginia, while some of the other generals erected were, like Lee and Jackson and Stewart. But so they recommended that the Davis monument be removed and be replaced with a monument celebrating the Union regiment of colored troops that were the first to enter Richmond upon the Confederacy's resignation or surrender. But nothing ever happened with that, as we see with many municipal efforts on things like this. It's a lot of talk and not a whole lot of action. But so once in the past 2 months or so, during these rebellions, when people started removing monuments ourselves, and then the city began in the beginning of June to remove monuments, beginning of July, we saw them take these monuments. They would tarp them up and take them away on tow trucks, as Elle mentioned. And we have since seen photos of them sitting in just a lawn space near the wastewater treatment center on the south side of the city. So right now, as far as we know, they're just kind of sitting out, wrapped in some tarps, waiting for the mayor or somebody to decide really what to do with them. Additionally, just kind of about the process of removal by the city is once people took it upon themselves to remove these monuments to white supremacy, the so-called leaders and people in positions of authority saw this as not only a affront to their legitimacy, but they declared it a public safety issue, and that's why that was the main impetus for the city to begin taking action. However, from a legal sense, the mayor did some legal gymnastics to take action to remove the monuments before city council had even taken a vote on it. I believe they've since passed a resolution that kind of approves post-mortem. But so they, starting on July 1 was when the Stonewall Jackson monument was removed by the city, which was also the same day that members of the sheriff's department, sheriff's deputies, attacked people that were demonstrating at the courthouse downtown, pepper spraying and assaulting folks. The sheriffs were when they were trying to do an eviction defense action. But yeah, so most of the monuments that were on city-owned property have come down, all but save, I think, the A.P. Hill monument, which he's also buried in, so that's part of why it hasn't been removed yet. But as Elle mentioned, the Lee Monument is on state property. And so that's part of why this legal injunction has been happening. Initially, it was a descendant of the person that deeded the land to the state for the monument, which has since been pulled. But now the ongoing injunction is from some residents of Monument Avenue. I believe it's part of the Monument Avenue Preservation Society, which are basically holdovers of this kind of lost cause narrative and people that like the Daughters of the Confederacy, stuff like that.
Something that's interesting too, Buzz, you say descendants, is that I think we saw a lot of this conversation be revisited or reinvigorated following the death of Heather Heyer at Unite the Right in Charlottesville in August 2017. And following that, there were some descendants who presented, a letter to both city council and to the mayor's office saying, hey, this is our ancestor and we would like you to take this statue down. And so, of course, the city didn't do that, but that statue has since fallen from one very windy night. But it, there's a lot of conversation, I think, around is the energy misplaced when we fixate on the monuments? But we consistently see organized white supremacy either invigorating folks to challenge the monument or, neocons fixating on the monument and kind of choosing that as a battleground. We've had a lot of neocons, either quote unquote lone wolves or groups of folks attempt to clean the graffiti off of the monuments, or we recently had somebody paint over a whole monument, paint over all the graffiti that was there. And a lot of the neocons or people we believe to be neocons who have been arrested because they, have a bunch of unregistered firearms, or they don't have a concealed carry, or they're carrying zip ties and just being violent. Those arrests have occurred around the monument. There have been very few of those folks who are arrested, of course. I can think of 2 instances where we got an arrest report that was not a protester, but was instead a white supremacist. But the monuments, whether it was in Charlottesville in 2017 or now, continue to be the space where organized white supremacists are, creating violence or coming to quote unquote defend that. And it is clear that the presence of those monuments emboldens neocons and organized white supremacists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because the monuments represent, or the monuments are such a visceral and material manifestation of white supremacy, it is an easy target for sure. In Richmond, though, because so much of the identity of Richmond has relied on Monument Avenue as an object, as a tourism piece, that, this has been a long time coming for Richmond. It wasn't just kind of, at the end of May, people got angry and just one day decided that we didn't like the monuments. This has been decades and decades of struggle by so many people. And the killing of George Floyd was the spark that we needed to ignite this flame of rebellion for people, not only in Richmond, but across Turtle Island, as we've seen.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing Buzz and Elle talk about the ongoing protests in Richmond, Virginia. Shifting from, as Elle, and you both have astutely put, the monuments are not the main thing. The monuments are, however, a lightning rod for white supremacist activity. But I'd kind of like to hear a little more about what the demonstrations around current day manifestations of white supremacy in the form of police murder have looked like. There's been the renaming of that circle, Marcus David Peters, and you said he was killed in 2018. How has resistance in the streets looked? How has BLM or Movement for Black Lives affiliated protests that haven't been focused on the statues appeared? And what sort of reaction have you seen from authorities? Buzz also mentioned that the state police, the state troopers have been really violent against demonstrators.
Yeah, the repression I have never seen state repression like this in Richmond or anywhere in the South or Appalachia where I have lived and done this work. The mass arrests, there was one night, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, at the very end of June where, like many cities have seen, a curfew was put into place and, 260 people were arrested. And, I haven't seen mass arrests like that in Richmond before, and it hasn't stopped. The arrests have been constant. And we've seen folks get arrested before an action even starts because, the state has decided that, this is park property and you can't be at a park after sunset. So this is a trespassing charge. And we see people, get popped and held for 11, 13 hours on their first charge, a trespassing charge. And I think a piece of it is that there are so many police jurisdictions, other than the ones that Buzz mentioned earlier. There's also, Enrico and Chesterfield, counties around us with enormous police forces. In, a lot of folks call Chesterfield Arresterfield. It is like a place where, the bonds are so high and the facilities are so poor and the repression is so violent there. And so the ability to bring in hundreds of police officers from so many different jurisdictions, not even including the Virginia State Police, has definitely attributed to that night of the curfew arrests, of the mass arrests. People were driving home from work and they got snatched out of their cars, pulled over and, taken out of their cars for not being in their house. People were snatched off their front porch. There was a viral video of someone leaning out their window, filming the police, and the police fired gas up at their, third floor apartment window. It has been obscene violence. And I think an unhelpful conversation that has been happening around that is one police department will say, well, that wasn't us, that was VSP, right? Richmond Police Department will say, VSP, they're the violent ones, it's not us. Or people will, be interested in identifying which departments are doing what on what nights, which I think, of course, is interesting and can be helpful, but it's unhelpful in that, like, the police are violent, right? And yes, all cops. And so to differentiate them from each other is I think, really unhelpful, because any of the police that we're seeing are engaging in this repression. And then Sheriff Irving at the Richmond City Jail, I had a defendant who had to immediately get surgery upon leaving jail because, they were held for 3 days with a broken hand, and jail medical refused to set that, right, or to treat that. The types of violence that poor Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience all the time, that kind of violence and criminalization surrounding incarceration, but, at a different scale, just simply because of the number of arrests that are happening. Somebody who was held in jail for 5 days with a traumatic brain injury because they were shot point blank in the skull with a rubber bullet, who once again, as soon as being released, immediately had to be brought to the hospital. And doing jail support for actions in Richmond, these things are kind of unprecedented for me. Once again, these are the types of things that our folks, the Richmond Bail Fund folks that we serve primarily, who are quote unquote non-political arrests, but of course, it's all political. But folks who experience more of what we call everyday criminalization have been enduring for, centuries. But there just seems to be absolutely no thought about the image of repression, which continues to reinforce for me the strategy that the state is using, which is, we're not going to drop the charges. We're going to beat the shit out of you. We're going to hold you for as long as we want. And we're going to charge you with dumb shit as a way to, of course, use repression to scare people out of the street. Or, I already caught a charge, I can't go back in the street, right? Let's charge as many people as we can, so that way we can neutralize kind of this force that is moving along this uprising.
Yeah, and it actually came to light in the past few days that the Richmond Police Department I believe still doesn't even have any kind of training or written policy around the use of chemical weapons like OC, pepper spray, or CS gas or tear gas. So police have been using these chemical agents indiscriminately, largely. Some of those materials have been expired. I believe on the first weekend of riots in Richmond, people were finding CS gas canisters that were over 7 years expired. And we noticed when they started using the new stuff, because it tasted different. You could really tell. The lower ranking pigs, as well as the officers, were just kind of using these methods indiscriminately without rhyme or reason, just kind of when they felt like it. But to your question on what additional targets have been in addition to the monuments, what I've seen is a really strong focus on gentrification and evictions, especially in this COVID era. A lot of folks in the streets have been linking police brutality with gentrification and evictions. And so that's been a really large target, along with just the police themselves. There's been the police and jails and prisons. So there've been multiple demonstrations that just go straight to the police headquarters or precinct. There have been several going down to the city jail, to show solidarity with the folks inside, as well as, various teach-ins and such like that. And then, other demos or marches, we've seen, of course, window smashing and property destruction happens. But since the initial weekend of riots, which was a bit more indiscriminate, what we've seen since with property destruction happen is that it's not so kind of willy-nilly, but it seems like people might be making choices on what institutions to target, whether it's a bougie hotel or a bar that is known for racist policies and conduct have been some of the targets in recent weeks. So I think there has been a broadening and linking of targets beyond just the Confederate monuments, as well as I've seen a decent bit of energy kind of put towards the municipal civic process, which I find interesting. I think folks in Richmond often try to kind of straddle the fence on whether the extent to engage in civic politics. Like, there's been lots of advocacy for progressive city council members because they're up for re-election, as well as, but there's also been targeting of the Commonwealth's attorney, a very specific drop the charges campaign, including a sit-in at her home in which, again, the police evicted people from that sit-in violently, making several arrests, as well as using chemical agents. So there's this attention, but also interplay of kind of engagement on the civic politics side, going to city council, targeting several council members in terms of their policies and positions, as well as a more militant street action.
By targeting, do you mean like applying pressure, like trying to contact them or call them out publicly and say, here's what you're doing, here's what you need to be doing, sort of thing, like as any constituency would do?
Yes, okay. Exactly. And so there's, some of that more kind of typical applying political pressure, but there's also, similar to the demonstration outside the Commonwealth attorney's home, there have been several demonstrations outside a particular city council member's home in the Jackson Ward neighborhood, which she has since uses some of the Richmond Police Department. I believe she's hired them as private security to stand outside her home because she really doesn't like loud noises or flashlights when people are getting gassed and beaten in the streets by the police.
There's something also in terms of targeting that I've seen specifically, there's a group of Black women, femmes, trans people who run a podcast and media, effort called Race Capital, who has done a lot of narrative work specifically around this idea of like, what is a monument to white supremacy? One of the demands which I'd like to read those before we wrap up, is remove all monuments to white supremacy in the city, from Confederate generals to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And some narrative work that I've seen them do is like John Marshall Courthouse is a monument to white supremacy, or City Hall is a monument to white supremacy. We saw young Black and Indigenous and people of color with a group called VSPN, the Virginia Student Power Network, perform an occupation of City Hall, which was like immediately repressed with chemical weapons and, violent, brutal force. But expanding, exactly what Buzz is saying, expanding like what is a monument to white supremacy and where does white supremacy function? Because like eviction work or doing demonstrations at the jail, those things have been happening in Richmond for years and years and years. But now including them inside of this demand, inside of the uprising for Black liberation in memory of George Floyd, I have seen a lot more people who were not making those connections begin to make those connections. And a lot of people who were not doing that kind of work who are now engaging with it with a similar analysis as to, this is as important, or, as Race Capital argues, maybe more important than these like traditional monuments or statues. Like, how is the courthouse not a monument to white supremacy when it, is the space where incarceration and eviction happens primarily to poor Black folks here in Richmond, at least?
Yeah, I think it's also been really interesting to see some of the dynamics that started even before this rebellion, just kind of in the era of COVID. There have been some various mutual aid and solidarity projects that have been going on in the city and in the region. And so I think that kind of laid a lot of the groundwork for folks to be engaged, like not only just having the time to do so, but folks creating these systems of dual power and alternative power, alternative to the state, and kind of getting connected and linked up through those networks. And then once the rebellion happened, there were a lot of these connections already formed or forming. And so it made it a lot easier to broaden and connect these different struggles. So we've, kind of having this, both the building of dual power, but also the militant, attack on white supremacy that we've seen in the physical street actions. So that's been really encouraging to see. And I think people are still having those conversations around wanting to expand our capacities for building alternative systems of power and sharing knowledge and such.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing Buzz and Elle talk about the ongoing protests in Richmond, Virginia. Do those sort of like nodes of power, these like discussions around the diffusiveness of white supremacist power in our society and these alternative community-based means for survival, have they been pretty successful in getting outside of just activist circles in terms of who's participating in it or the dialogue that they engage in or who's being served by them?
I think so. At least I'll just use the Richmond Mutual Aid Project, which I'm not particularly involved in personally, but just seeing kind of the cross section of folks that have been engaged in that work, it seems pretty broad. And I think, that's a continual effort to kind of question ourselves in the work that we do in terms of, who's participating, who's not participating, and why, and how can we change that to be more equitable in our work. But I think there's a tendency in Richmond, from some people at least, to not just kind of group in folks to existing organizations or groups, but also a really big encouragement on autonomy and kind of having folks form their own crew to meet their goals, whether it's a mutual aid project or more of a street-based affinity group. But I think all these different constellations of networks continue to grow.
Yeah, and I think the Bail Fund is like an interesting case study as a container where, it was just three of us running this bail fund, a prison pastor, myself, and another young queer person. And now, because of the uprising, there are a lot of people who've been interested in in performing jail support for protesters who are arrested at the rebellion. And those people then get skilled up on running a hotline or how to post a bond or, using court databases, those kinds of things. And now we have like upwards of 30 volunteers who are providing defendant support or anti-repression support, not just to the, almost 400 defendants, maybe even more than that we have total since the rebellion, but to also folks who we primarily serve who experience criminalization there every day. So, and I think some of that is true for Richmond Mutual Aid and disaster relief as well, where, people come in because they think that it's like a COVID food bank, right? And then there's political education that happens inside of that of like, hey, this is our political affiliation, and this is what we believe white supremacy is and how it functions, and this is what we believe reparations is and how it should function. And so, there, whether it's COVID or whether it's the rebellion, these care work containers are able to bring people more deeply into the work in the city that has been happening, before the rebellion. Kind of catching that energy and saying, hey, this work has to continue. And so the bail fund has been able to rapidly expand, which we've had to, because as people have learned about us because of the uprising, we're now reaching more and more folks who are not being arrested at the uprising, but who have a loved one who's being held on cash bail or a loved one who gets arrested and they need support figuring out how to navigate that system. And yeah, that's been probably the thing that has made my heart feel so full and so excited right now in the midst of all of this violence and harm, has been the way that folks are stepping up to do the work that isn't just happening in the street.
Have you seen the city or the county respond to the presence of the bail fund over the time that it's been existing? Like, I've heard of other cities modifying the way that, or counties modifying the way that they impose bail based on the assumption that somebody is going to be there on a regular to pay someone's bail, and either therefore increasing the amount of bail that's being charged, or maybe shifting to another, to denying bail to more people because there's a presumption of, well, we really do want to hold this person, despite the fact that there's a community resource out there that might get them out.
Yeah, so in terms of an official capacity, we were approached by somebody who works at the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, who basically on the internet said, y'all are scammers, there's no cash bail in Richmond, because the Commonwealth Attorney always runs on this platform of no cash bail, when what they actually mean is we won't advocate for cash bail to the judge, but of course, these judges have been on the bench for so long, and they're going to continue to use the same tools that they've used in their career. They don't give a shit, what the Commonwealth Attorney's Office asks for. And so that has been, I think, really fascinating to us, that even people in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office don't realize that we have, bailed out 100 people or more in Richmond and the surrounding counties, specifically through, the cash bail mechanism. And I think kind of exposing that lack of knowledge only happened because the bail fund, we started to be able to get, funds to post more and more bails. In terms of the actual process of posting a bond, there have been situations where we are denied access for very silly or small things that we've never had that experience before. So them being like, you can't use this address, somebody else just used this address, because we use a consolidated address for the bail fund. So obviously you don't live there, when that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in terms of the code for if you live where you're asking for the bond receipt to be mailed, or the paperwork once the bond is able to be reclaimed. And, we've also seen really petty bails for people who it's their first offense. And, there's just no situation. They live in Richmond. There's just no reason for them to get a bail, which, I personally believe is because the state now knows that we have money. And I think it's also been really interesting. The sheriff specifically at the jail have become less and less and less willing to cooperate with us, with jail support, with getting folks out. And they are holding people longer for less charges. And I sometimes wonder, is that to repress the act of protest, to kind of scare people or make them feel, God, I don't want to get fucking arrested again. That was horrible. And is it also to say, kind of you to jail support into the bail fund. We also had a magistrate recently suggest that you have to have written consent from a person who you're bailing out. And we use an informed consent model where the person who's referring them just has to have spoken to the defendant, and the defendant has to say, yeah, I want to be bailed out. Because, of course, we've had situations where people say that they don't want to be bailed out because of whatever pretrial, sometimes people have home electronic monitoring and they don't have a stable place where they live most of the time. They live in a bunch of different places, and so they don't want to live that way, or they don't want to expose the people who live where their address is on paper. And so, but we've never heard that before, right? And that would completely change our ability to bail people out if we had to have some sort of written consent from the people that we post bail for. So there hasn't been an explicit acknowledgement from the state, and it hasn't been a situation where all of a sudden everybody has a $10,000 bond like you see in Soda City, where the bonds have just gotten so high. But we definitely know that they know about us and the work that we do, and we do see them threaten us with some regularity or make things more difficult than they have to be, which wasn't the case when we were functioning as the Richmond Bail Fund for the 3 years before this.
When you refer to Soda City, you're referring to Columbia, South Carolina?
That's correct.
Shifting back to the demonstrations, just really briefly to get sort of a picture, are they still ongoing on a regular basis, or has the repression sort of slowed it down, do you think, or just the amount of time and people sort of dealing with the fact that they're also living in a pandemic, and sort of how many folks are showing up to them?
That's a really great question. There's just been continual waves, and I think that's something to keep in mind. I will say, just in the past maybe 2 weeks, there's, with rising COVID rates again, I think there is just a kind of public health fear. However, time gets really screwy when we're in moments of rebellion. Things expand, and time expands and contracts all at the same time. So I think what we've seen in Richmond is continual waves of action. And the reclaimed space at Marcus David Peters Circle has been really instrumental in maintaining some sort of presence. Maybe if there's not even an explicit march or demonstration called for, the people just kind of know instinctively to go to MDP Circle and at least hang out, just kind of take in the redecoration of the monument pedestal and just being in community with each other. So it feels like, maybe every week or every 2 weeks, there's an explicit demonstration. There were several weeks where it was kind of something explicit was happening every day or almost every day. I think it's also important to remember we are on our third police chief of this rebellion.
Holy.
We started out with Chief William Smith, who had been in the interim chief position. He resigned in mid-June after a lot of public pressure. Then the city and RPD brought up William Jody Blackwell as an interim chief. He only lasted 10 days. He was the chief of staff and has returned to his position as chief of staff. But it came out pretty quickly after he became interim chief. It came out that Jody Blackwell himself has a history of killing an unarmed man in Richmond back in 2008, I believe it was. And so he steps down, and then the mayor, kind of without any due process that he had previously promised to not only the people of Richmond, but city council itself, he just kind of one day up and announced that he was bringing in another Chief Smith. This is Chief Smith from Charlotte, Mecklenburg, who folks in the region will know that the city of Charlotte, Mecklenburg had a restraining order against the police department and Chief Smith, who was the deputy chief down there, for their use of force and chemical weapons, particularly. And so
during the current uprising, you mean, or during the Charlotte uprising of 2016, or which?
I believe that was from that restraining order came out of the Charlotte uprising. And so and I believe that's still in place, but Mayor Stoney here in Richmond decided that he seemed like a good candidate, and so brought him in. and he started. The current Chief Smith began his reign of terror on July 1, and so it's been interesting to kind of note how these different personalities at the head of the snake have changed their approach to repression.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing Buzz and Elle talk about the ongoing protests in Richmond, Virginia. Are there any groups in particular that are maybe good places for folks outside of the area to pay attention to housing defense, or any tenant unions that stand out? Because you both mentioned, like, I believe you both mentioned that during this pandemic, this has been like another focal point and shift of people unifying, like the call for like supporting Black life and like just people's lives in general being tied into the ability to have stable housing.
Yeah, there's two in particular that come to mind, and Elle, feel free to add on. I want to lift up the Leaders of the New South, which is a long time organizing body, Black-led organizing body that has been organizing primarily in public housing communities for years. And then more recently, there has been the establishment of a Richmond Tenants Union, and they've been really instrumental in doing some of this kind of new phase of eviction defense. And a lot of what they're doing, to my understanding, is just letting people know that they have a pending eviction. What we've seen in Richmond is that most of the adjudications of evictions happen because the tenants don't even know that they are on file to have an eviction. So they do notifications and some fundraising to pay some of those legal costs or rent costs, as well as broader organizing as tenants.
Yeah, and those two organizations kind of in coalition also provide court support outside of John Marshall Courthouse for folks that are experiencing eviction. I would also say, just as far as like organizing that's going on in Richmond, on socials, I think that Richmond Mutual Aid Disaster Relief is a good place to follow. Race Capital as well. Richmond Strike. You can follow the Bail Fund on Twitter or Instagram at RVA Bail Fund. ASH, River City Medic Collect. I mean, there are so many folks who are not necessarily citizen journalists, but who are sharing information about work that's being done and that needs to be done, actions that are coming up, all of those pieces. And Buzz, I don't know if I missed some that you want to add to.
Could you say a little more quickly about ASH and River City? I didn't catch the name.
Yeah, so ASH on Twitter, Anti-Fascists of the Seven Hills, and then River City Medic Collective are two different organizations that will share either analyses or actions, events, things that are going on in Richmond. Mm.
Yeah, I will say, I think Richmond might have one of the highest per capita street medic presence. There have been so many folks getting trained on street medics and just kind of community health initiatives. That seems to be a big entry point for a lot of folks in organizing and kind of connecting to a broader RAD community. Yeah, and I will say that some of our independent journalists here in Richmond have been really great at capturing a lot of what has been occurring. Even like the students at the independent student paper at VCU, the Commonwealth Times, those youth have been pretty amazing about their consistency and coming out on the street and reporting. So you can check out the Commonwealth Times and some of their reporters. And there's a host of folks. If you're on Twitter, you can kind of start to find some of those. But Elle mentioned earlier the Virginia Student Power Network and their chapter at Virginia Commonwealth University have been really awesome in raising up demands. The Justice and Reformation project, which is headed by the sister of Marcus David Peters, Princess Blanding, has been an amazing show of strength throughout the past year since her brother's death, and really leading these demands and the coalition of different groups and individuals standing in solidarity with Princess and to honor her brother.
Another account for some anti-repression news is Stark, Scuffletown Anti-Repression Committee, who often will work with defendants when they experience door knocks from federal or state or local police put out a statement about that, or just kind of other helpful anti-repression resources that are contextually specific in Richmond and Virginia.
And Richmond is Burning is another good one just for general updates and information. You can find them on Instagram, Twitter, I believe. Richmond is Burning on Instagram, Burning Richmond on Twitter.
That's awesome. That's a plethora of different sources where folks can keep up on this. Cool. Well, thank you both very much for this conversation. Is there anything that I failed to ask about that you wanted to mention before we get off the horn?
Yeah, just before you let us go, do you mind if I read those demands?
Please.
So the demands that have been circulated widely in Richmond are, one, to reopen the case of Marcus David Peters' murder by Richmond police, to defund the police, to drop all charges against every protester, to remove all monuments to white supremacy in the city, from Confederate generals to United Daughters of the Confederacy, to establish an independent civilian review board with subpoena power that is separate from the Richmond Police Department, to establish and fully fund the Marcus Alert System, and to release the names of all RPD officers currently under investigation for use of force misconduct. And that Marcus Alert System is infrastructure that Justice and Reformation and Princess Blanding have been advocating for since Marcus's murder, that would create infrastructure where a mental health worker would respond to folks that are experiencing a mental health crisis rather than the police.
I guess actually, now that I'm thinking about it too, like a last question that I have, has there been any threat of federal intervention in Richmond as we saw in Portland and has been sort of coming up in some other cities? And also, have there been any use of federal felonies or grand juries that you're aware of in Richmond since the uprising began?
So I'm not aware of grand juries yet. However, I'm very confident that there is federal presence, and we know that that there's federal presence in Richmond. Absolutely. Yeah, as far as federal charges, is not a situation. I think on your last episode, AC said this. It's not a situation of like, will it come, but when. And so we're kind of in that space of wondering what state surveillance will reveal and what charges will be brought. Yeah, Buzz, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just kind of to add on. I think you said it well. We do have an FBI field office in Richmond. It's right across the street from the John Marshall Courthouse. We do have a DHS, Department of Homeland Security office in the federal courthouse that is also downtown across the street from City Hall. We know that there is a member of the Richmond Police Department that is the DHS liaison. Haven't seen him on the streets anytime recently, but we kind of operate with the assumption that at least federal intelligence activities are happening, although I have not seen any street presence of federal agents, certainly not like we have seen in Portland, although some of the tactics have been similar, carried out by the state police and city police.
Elle and Buzz, thank you so much for having this conversation, and we'll be sure to include a lot of links to the organizations and media sources that you mentioned, and to the bail fund. Thanks a lot for all you're doing and for taking the time to have this conversation.
Great, thank you. You can also follow the Telegram channel, t.me/Richmond Rebellion. Just general updates on when demos are happening and various links.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.